Hello, welcome. I'm Andy Kaufman, and I am continuing our journey through Second Samuel. So I'm glad you could join us today, or whenever you get around to watching this. Uh, so when I was in high school, I went to work with my friend on his family farm, uh, a Christmas tree farm, and I wasn't a very good employee. So I'd show up late. Sometimes my mom would come down and wake me up and ask if I shouldn't be at work. And I'd say, well, no, we're not working today, or we're starting late today. And then my friend, who I worked with, would call and ask where I was. Uh, Plus, I wasn't a very good farmer. It's a little bit of a talent to drive a tractor straight, and I never quite got the hang of it. And I didn't know a lot of things that people who grow up on a farm learn as they go along when they're young. But I was pretty good at some things. I could calculate putting fertilizer and chemicals down to the ounce. And one time I even used matrix math to figure out the right mix of some chemicals. It's the only time in my life that I used matrix math. I got good at grading Christmas trees, and so I would do all the grading of the Christmas trees, and so on. There were other things, and so I wasn't a total loser. Uh, but the boss took a chance in the beginning and had a lot of patience when I did things that probably deserved firing. And then they even helped me finish college. And if I hadn't done that, I probably wouldn't have gone to law school and I wouldn't have gone to seminary. And so you are the beneficiary of their kindness. Well, not only do other people need us to show them loving kindness, and we might need to receive it ourselves, we need to do it because when we do it, we are living, loving, and acting like Jesus. And when we do that, we are more fully human because that's what we were made to be. So the passage today is about how God's people should look for others to whom they can show God's loving kindness. And that passage is 2 Samuel chapter 9. And we'll see how David's a man after God's own heart, how he sought someone out to whom he could show loving kindness and then followed through by showing loving kindness to the person that he found, even though that person was an enemy, really, and not worthy of his kindness. So in the first part, 2 Samuel 9, 1 to 8, we'll see that a person after God's own heart will seek out someone to whom they can show loving kindness. So that's 2 Samuel 9, 1 to 8. And I switched over to the new NASB Bible because that's what I use in Sunday school class, and so it's a lot easier to use the same version. So 2 Samuel 9, 1 to 8. Then David said, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul so that I could show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they summoned him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. The king said, is there no one remaining of the house of Saul to whom I could show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan, one who is disabled in both feet. So the king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodabar. Then the king sent messengers who brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar. Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, "Here is your servant." Then David said to him, "Do not be afraid, for I will assuredly show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore you to all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table regularly." Again he prostrated himself and said, "What is your servant that you should be concerned about a dead dog like me?" So remember where we are. Uh, David has been made king of all Israel, and he's defeated Saul's armies. In chapter 7, he wanted to build a structure for the Ark of the Covenant, but God said, "No, you're not going to build me a structure, a house, but I will build you a dynastic house." The events recorded in chapter 8 probably came before chapter 7 chronologically, but we see how David achieved victory over all the nations around him, to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. We've also been told that David is a man after God's own heart. And so when he's at his best, he is a good example of living a God-like life and a Christ-like life. So David decides, "Hey, I'd like to show some kindness to someone, if there's anyone left from Saul's house, for the sake of my friend Jonathan, who was Saul's son." Now, kindness is a very good Hebrew word, chesed. It's not hesed and it's not kesed. It's something in between. But Americans don't talk in gutturals, and so it's very difficult for us to do. And according to the Halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, the word is often used to describe God's relationship with the people or an individual, and especially his relationship with Israel. And it means faithfulness, goodness, graciousness. It's often translated loving kindness or loyal love. And so we should seek out people to whom we can show God's kindness. And so that would be God's faithfulness, goodness, graciousness, loyal love, loving kindness. And remember that for years, Saul had chased David all over Israel and had tried to kill him on many occasions. And so it's an amazing thing that David would want to show chesed to a member of Saul's family. Except that David and Jonathan were very close friends, and so David was doing it for Jonathan's sake. And so we might decide to do something like this for Jesus' sake, given all that he has done for us. Then in verses 2 and 3, we see how David goes about finding someone from Saul's family. And so David has a good plan. He brings in Ziba, who is a servant in the house of Saul, and asks him if there is anyone still remaining of Saul's family, so that David can show that person the faithfulness, goodness, and graciousness of God. So we may know someone that we can do this for, or we can ask others to help us find someone so that we can show them God's kindness. Now, sometimes we just have to open our eyes and we will see someone. It might even be our spouse or our parents or our children. It might be a neighbor, or it could be someone at church, because all of us go in person to church if we're able to do that, right? Of course. It might be an employee or a boss or maybe a fellow worker. If we don't see someone, we can ask people we know, or we could ask our pastor, and so on and so on, and they may know someone. We can always pray, and God will show us if he has anyone in mind. He'll bring them right across our path. And the rest of verse 3 and 4, Ziba tells David about a son of Jonathan. And so let's see there. It says, And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan who is disabled in both feet." So the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodabar." Well, Ziba knows of this son of Jonathan who's crippled in both feet. We saw this earlier, that his nurse had dropped him when she was fleeing from, I think Ishbosheth was attacking. So she was fleeing and accidentally dropped him. But he's living with Machir, the son of Amiel, in a place called Lodabar. And but Ziba doesn't give the name of the person yet. Well, we're not sure exactly where Lodabar is. There's a mention of Machir in later chapters, and he seems to be from the area of Gilead, and that would be on the east side of the Jordan and between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, looking south to north. And Lodabar was probably in the northern part of this area. Now, Lodabar is an interesting name for a town, though. Dabar is a noun, and it means word, matter, or thing. And lo is a negation. And so, no. So lo means no. And so literally, lo dabar means no word, no matter, or no thing, or nothing. And so this son of Jonathan is literally and figuratively living in Nothingville, Lodabar. Uh, but we can ask around and let others tell us about those to whom we can show loving kindness. And so David now has found somebody, and in verse 5, he sends for this son of Jonathan. And it says, then King David sent messengers who brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar. So once we identify someone to whom we can show God's kindness, then we must make appropriate contact with them. Now, we do have to be careful about how we approach this, because we are not King David. He can just send people and they will bring the recipient to him, and the recipient will come because the king has sent for him. But we're not King David. And so we might even have to do it anonymously so we don't embarrass or offend the recipient. If we already know them pretty well, we could say, "Hey, I want to do something to show you God's kindness, and this is what I want to do. What do you think?" There's a story that Chuck Swindoll tells about an old man who was waiting in line at the drive-through at a fast food restaurant. And there was a young woman behind him who kept honking at him and sticking her head out the window and yelling at him and giving him all kinds of grief because he was taking too long at the little speaker thing. So when he pulled up to pay, he told the attendant that he wanted to pay for her food too. And when he pulled forward and the young woman got to the pay window herself, he could hear the attendant telling her, "Hey, that guy paid for your food." And so then she leaned out her window and yelled, "Thank you, thank you." Maybe she felt bad for how she had been behaving. Well, then when he got to the pickup window, he showed that attendant both receipts and took his food, and he took her food too, since he had paid for it. And now she was going to have to go back in line and order again if she wanted her food. And Chuck says the moral of that story is, don't mess around with old people. All right, well, that probably was not showing Hesed to someone, but it's a good story. Now, buying her food was showing her Hesed, but then taking it probably just made him feel better and might have taught her a lesson, maybe. In verse 6, we find out who this son of Jonathan is. And it says there, 9:6 says, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, Here is your servant. Now, I always thought it was Mephibosheth because I keep slipping. But someone at church once asked me if that was really correct. And so I went back and looked at the Hebrew, and the accent marker is over the bo. And so it's Mephibosheth. And so it's always good to go look at the original text to see what it says. And the guy who asked me, he doesn't even know Hebrew. And so he's a pretty smart guy. But what would Mephibosheth be thinking? Typically, when a new king came into power, he would kill all of the family of the previous king because they would have a claim to the throne. And since Mephibosheth was Jonathan's son, he has a claim to the throne. And so he's probably thinking, all right, the time has come. King David is going to put me to death. So we don't know what other people might be thinking. And so we should be mindful that these people might be afraid, or they might be embarrassed, or they might feel unworthy to receive God's kindness from us. And so we need to be sensitive to how they might be feeling. Well, in verses 6 to 7, David puts Mephibosheth at ease and tells him what he's going to do for him. And so it says, 6 to 7. Then David said to him, Do not be afraid, for I will assuredly show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table regularly. Well, David comes right out and tells Mephibosheth what he's going to do for him. He's not going to kill him. In fact, he's going to restore to Mephibosheth all the lands of Saul, who was his grandfather, and then Mephibosheth will eat regularly at David's table. Now, David would have taken control of Saul's lands when he became king, but Mephibosheth probably had a right to the lands because he was Saul's grandson, and so David is recognizing his rights. That would have been another reason for David to kill all of Saul's descendants so that nobody would have a claim to Saul's lands, and then they would default to be his. If David were greedy, that is, but David's a man after God's own heart, and so he is not greedy. Well, to eat at David's table was a special thing too. Mephibosheth will be treated almost as one of David's sons. And this is all for the sake of David's friend Jonathan. So when we are going to help people out by showing them God's kindness, we should put them at ease and make them feel accepted. Well, Mephibosheth is quite aware of what David is doing here, and so he responds as we might expect, and it does that in verse 8. And it says, Again, he, Mephibosheth, prostrated himself and said, What is your servant that you should be concerned about a dead dog like me? So Mephibosheth is amazed that David would treat him so well. He says he's a dead dog, a term of self-abasement. Mephibosheth had no expectation that anyone would ever do anything for him because he's a cripple and a threat to the throne and living in Nothingville. But here is the king not killing him and in fact restoring his family lands to him and treating him like a son. And it's interesting that Mephibosheth is crippled. And so one reason that a king would have lots of sons is so that they could fight for him in the army. And Mephibosheth is unable to bring anything to help David out. So there's no benefit to David for having Mephibosheth around, except for showing God's loyal love to somebody. And so we have to remember that people that we want to help might feel unworthy of our concern. Well, David has made a lot of promises to Mephibosheth, but a person after God's own heart follows through by actually showing God's loving kindness to others. And that's the second part of the chapter, verses 9 to 13. And so let's read that. 9 to 13. Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, "Everything that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson will have food to eat. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "In accordance with everything that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he ate at the king's table regularly, and he was disabled in his 2 feet. So in the first part, verses 9 and 10, David summons the servant Ziba and informs him of his decision. "I am giving everything that belonged to Saul and his house and to his grandson Mephibosheth. Therefore Ziba and his family will now serve Mephibosheth and produce food for him to eat. However, Mephibosheth will eat at David's table in Jerusalem." And so you have to kind of wonder what Ziba and these 15 sons and 20 servants had been doing. They had probably been running the lands and sort of like a steward. And so Ziba is kind of losing a position that maybe he had. So for all practical purposes, it was probably like the land belonged to him. Anyhow, once we make our plan and appropriately approach the recipient to tell them, then we must follow through and show kindness and acceptance to them. And so we can't be all talk and no do. And it might be that we do this ourselves or that we hire or recruit others to do it for us. Here, David has commanded the servant Ziba to carry it out. And since David is the king and Ziba is a servant, Ziba will do it, as he says in verse 11, where it says, Ziba said to the king, "In accordance with everything that my lord the king commands, his servant, your servant, will do." Now, of course, we probably don't have a lot of slaves around that we can order around. And so we may need to find people who will help us show God's kindness to others. But there will be things that we can do ourselves, as the rest of verse 11 says. It says, "So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons." Well, David had control over his own table, and so he chose to treat Mephibosheth as a son. And so we too can treat other people like they are family. And the people we show loving kindness to may have family of their own, and we can show them kindness too. And we see that in verse 12, where it says that Mephibosheth had a son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So at David's command, Ziba and his family are now going to serve Mephibosheth and his family. And so we might be able to arrange for others to help those in need on an ongoing basis. Of course, we have many organizations that we can give money to, and they help poor people with food and other necessities of life. And so we could help them through regular giving to a nonprofit of some sort. If we have the capacity in a business, we could hire someone and train them for a job and a career, and that would make a big difference in their lives going forward. We could invite people to our church where they can receive ongoing teaching from the Bible and fellowship with other Christians. And so in verse 13, we see how it turned out for Mephibosheth. It says, so Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he ate at the king's table regularly, and he was disabled in his 2 feet. So David followed through, and Mephibosheth's life was totally changed. He had been an enemy of the king living in Nothingville, Lodabar. Now he has all of his grandfather's property, a family of servants to take care of him, and he lives in Jerusalem, where he eats at the king's table and is treated like the king's son. But he's still crippled in both feet, it says. And so the moral of that story is treat those in need as family, even though they might remain handicapped in some way. And so there's a saying that goes, poor people make poor decisions. And so we have to be prepared for people to continue to make poor decisions no matter how much we help them. And so, the question we can ask ourselves is how many times have we ourselves made poor decisions? When we help people, but they don't change as fast as we think they should, it might be annoying. And we have to remember that it can take time for people to learn the lessons of financial management or treating others well or taking care of their health, parenting their children. And so our job is to be patient with them, but we have to be wise as well. Well, this story is a very good parable of God's loving kindness for us. We are, when we're not saved, we are God's enemies, and we're living in Nothingville, and we're crippled by sin. And God looks around and says, is there anyone to whom I can show my loving kindness? And he reaches into Nothingville and saves us from our life of sin. And we receive figuratively the land and the property that our father Abraham, or our father Adam, lost in Genesis 3. And we will eat at God's table as his sons and daughters. And so it's a very, very nice parable of God's grace and love for us. Well, like David, we can look around or ask around to find out if there's anyone to whom we can show God's loving kindness. And when we find them, we ourselves, or we could work through others, to help them in their need. We got to remember to be wise about how we go about this, wise about how we treat people, and wise about how we go about helping them. Sometimes the wise thing to do is to work through a nonprofit that has experience and expertise. We have to remember, too, that they might still be handicapped for a long time after we help them. And so it's going to require patience on our part. Now, when I was a Mephibosheth, someone helped me. And if it wasn't for their help, it's questionable whether I would be talking to you here today. Although I do think that God would have found another way if this is what he wanted me to do. All right. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we can get about our day. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the story of David and Mephibosheth. Thank you for the example that David gives us of how to show your loving kindness to others. but thank you for how this story is really a parable about how you show your loving kindness to us when we're in sin. We are Mephibosheths in a way, and we need you to reach into our Nothingville and take us to Jerusalem where we can eat at your table, be your children, and experience your grace, love, and mercy. So thank you for that. Thank you for Jesus, who died and rose to make this all possible. And we pray this in his name. Amen. Amen. All right. Well, thank you for joining me. Next week, I'm going to be at Canby Alliance Church, preaching at Canby Alliance Church. And the sermon usually starts somewhere between 9:45 and 10. So I'll be a little later, and God willing, I will put it up on Facebook as usual. But thank you for joining me today, and hope to see you next week from Canby Alliance Church. Have a great week, and remember to look around for some Mephibosheths to help out. Have a great week. Bye-bye.